Welcome back to another episode of Upon Request here with Eric Johnson, Carolina Santamaria, and myself, Mikel Lejean. As the world watches the height of conflicts in Palestine, Sudan, and the Congo, we wanted to be sure to give platform and attention to each of these conflicts. And so, over this course of this series of recordings, we wanted to bring in folks that have different perspectives, but but also we wanted to navigate the complexity of these issues on our own. So you'll be seeing folks jumping in and out of these series. And today we're really honored to actually have a guest who is very close to the conflict in Sudan in terms of experience, lived experience, but also organizing, and someone that I really admire who brings a whole swath of different perspectives and different real world experience. So we have Mohammed Elnaiem. He's an academic, an activist, and the co-founder of Decolonial Centre, and that's CENTRE, the British spelling for folks in the US. Welcome in, Mo. Is there anything that you want to share about yourself that people should know about you, or how you want to be represented in the world? So that could be your intro.
Yeah, thank you. I guess when I'm coming into this conversation on Sudan, maybe the best way to think about me is not so much as an expert or an analyst or something like that, but just a person who grew up for most of his life outside of Sudan, trying to make sense of Sudan, and someone who feels he has like a personal stake in trying to change Sudan. Um, on the more personal side of things, I am in a period of transition in my life right now, and I'm trying to build the Decolonial Centre, which is one of the projects I'm involved with. But I'm also just really feeling like I'm moving into adulthood right now. So I guess that's the best way to try to understand who I am.
Hmm. Yeah, the transition to adulthood is a complex one that we'll probably do in a whole nother episode. I feel like adulthood
Yeah,
starts later and later given the state of capitalism and what we have available to us as young people. Um,
100%.
but we'll save that for another day. Maybe we'll have you back and you can tell us how it's been for you. Um, yeah, I think for listeners, I feel like a lot of folks don't know about Sudan. I think a lot of people remember maybe Darfur because that was a really prevalent campaign. I think folks might also consider the like Sudanese boys and like the Sudanese rebels and all this stuff. Like there's a lot of very mainstream annotations of what Sudan is and what Sudan could be. I think South Sudan and Sudan separating is another flashpoint as well. But I also wanted to share some of like the beauty and the richness within Sudan. And thank you, Kato, for like kind of pulling together this little backdrop. Sudan is one of the richest African countries in terms of archaeological sites. Ruins of the ancient kingdom of Kush are found at Gebel Barkal. Am I saying that right?
Yeah.
Ooh, look at me. I'm on fire already. And associated sites in the Nile Valley. They were collectively designated as UNESCO World Heritage Sites in 2003. And so when we talk about places of conflict, I think so much of that conflict becomes the conversation point and it becomes the
Hmm.
reference point, and we lose a lot of the culture, a lot of the people, a lot of the like real things that matter of loss. There's obviously the loss of life. There's obviously the like all the things that come up with conflict and violence and clashes. But for me, I really do feel like there's this deep sense of we lose the story of the place before and after the conflict and even during the conflict. So I think before we get into like what is happening currently in Sudan, I'd love to hear from you, Mo. Like, what do you think about when you think about your country? What do you want people to know about Sudan outside of the conflict? And if that's
Hmm.
even, maybe the right question to ask.
No, it is the right question to ask because whether we like it or not, that's how people are going to understand it when every once in a while, sporadically, it's on the news. But one of the things that I like to remember is actually the revolution that preceded this conflict. In 2019 and 2020, Sudanese people rose up and overthrew a dictatorship of 30 years. And their demand was a transition to civil democracy. But their understanding of what civil democracy was supposed to be far greater than what we understand it today. in the sense of they had a concept which the word was medaniya in Arabic, and that means civil state. But it meant much more than that to them. It meant fulfilling their aspirations, because one of the things a lot of the youth that were involved in that, if you're in Sudan and you're young and you want to find a job, unemployment rates are extremely high. Sudan is part of that world where the vast majority of people are redundant, unemployed, people with skills, people who want to build their country and build their nation. And those are the people who are at the forefront of that revolution. And in 2020, when I went back and joined the revolution, in fact, I arrived in Sudan the day before the dictator of 30 years was arrested and overthrown. And we had a sit-in front of the military headquarters. And even after the dictator was taken down, the sit-in continued. And the sit-in was a space of joy and creativity. There was one corner of the sit-in which was just dedicated to reggae music, for example, and that's where all the reggae musicians would come together. There was another that where all the artists and graffiti artists would come and create their art. And this is, in a very repressive country that was under a dictatorship, which for the most part banned certain expressions of art that we had in this space. But also it was a space where there was no money, didn't matter. There was constant food, constant debates, step ladders where people would debate and discuss. And it was a space where people from all over the country had been so divided by the previous regime, and divided even before that during colonialism, came together in a democratic space. And of course, this is a story that's familiar to many people. It happened in Egypt, in Tahrir Square. You had that kind of spirit. You could see a bit of it in the Occupy movement in the United States. The movement of the squares is what many people call it. But of course, now we're in a war, and this is the result of the intransigence of the systems that exist that refuse to concede to the demands of people and would rather watch the whole world burn to the ground than to provide power to the people.
I'm really happy that you mentioned Egypt, because I feel like that was the first place that my mind was going, is like Arab Spring, people taking back the commons, the squares of the public. And I think, I was also thinking about Syria as well, right? The Syrian conflict, for folks that don't know, is between Bashar al-Assad and young people that felt really disenfranchised. We're talking about young people that had farms, family farms for generations, who were impacted by the drought, and it was like a drought that affected every part of that Middle East, Mesopotamia, Green Crescent area back in that time. It caused massive fires in Russia that basically smoked out entire cities of Russia, and like hundreds of people died from suffocation overnight. It was a really bad time. And so imagine you as a farmer who has taken over your family plot, now have nothing to grow. And it forced everyone into the urban centers. And because there was no jobs, there was no livelihood, these folks just, they don't know what to do. They're like, so what do you want me to do now? How do you expect me to find food? How do you expect me to find happiness? How do you expect me to feel alive when everything feels so dead around me? And I think that there's a lot of spark points in Syria, and there's a lot of like external and internal factors, but that's kind of an often overlooked portion, is, the ability for the young populace to feel hope in whatever the future is that the state has decided for him. And as someone from Trinidad, that's a lot of the Vice News documentary from years ago, back in 2014. They did a cocaine, guns, and some kind of documentary where they were talking about the what is it called? They had put in basically a thing where a military incurred curfew and it was basically Trinidad per capita was the most violent place in the world for 2 years. And it was related to drugs, but it was also related to just like young people not having a lot of options. And, as someone who has seen how the Caribbean has been completely colonized in the neo-colonialist way, this, external corporations coming in, setting up shop, dictating the flow of exported goods, where we have to export raw goods to be processed to then come back and pay 27 times the price for chocolate, for instance, even though we're a huge producer of chocolate. All of these things kind of become the foundation of what feels like the explosive that supercharges conflict. Um, and so for me, I'm like, I'm thinking about a lot of those things, and I feel like in all of that thinking, you kind of get lost. Like I feel like I just got
Mm.
lost in that deep dive.
Yeah.
And so, like when you think about parsing through all of the factors that have led to where Sudan is there a simple answer for what has led to the state of Sudan currently? Is there, yeah, a conversation that you would want to have around how it's gotten to the place that it's at?
Well, I think what you just said was something that resonated with me a lot because, especially on the gangs issue, right now, Sudan is stuck in a conflict between a militia and the army, but the army itself being held hostage by people who have their sympathies with the former regime.
Mm,
For a lot of people who believed in the democratic aspirations and visions that I was talking about in the square, or in our case, in front of the military headquarters, sit-in, some people have unfortunately given up hope on that, and some have thrown their lot behind the army. Some of the political elites under a coalition called Taqaddum have thrown their lot behind the militia. And that space of creativity, I think, is really important because it's about what do you do, right? If you're stuck, and maybe we can have this open in a sense of more of a global conversation in which we could also talk about Sudan, so that people can kind of get a sense of the fact that some of the same recipes for that kind of disaster that's in Sudan, which none of us ever saw happening, or happening across the world. And the first places in which that kind of recipe for disaster will take place is the global South countries and the formerly colonized countries. Because if you're during the revolution in Sudan, you're someone who maybe didn't go to university, or maybe graduated from medical school, or maybe was an artist, but regardless of your background, there were no opportunities for you. If you made your way down to the square of the sit-in, and your creativity all of a sudden mattered. You being an artist, you could be a muralist and you could paint on the walls. If you were someone who had a deep political education, you could go on the step ladder and have a debate and have a discussion. If you were a medical student, you could volunteer to aid those people who were shot down by the police and shot down by the militias. In general, there was a creative outlet, but one of the biggest outlets for people in that situation and circumstance were what we called the resistance committees. And the resistance committees, in the beginning, they organized the marches, but then throughout the entire revolution, they ended up becoming like a space for taking care of your neighborhood, engaging in mutual aid, and eventually and then they organized themselves from neighborhood to neighborhood, collaborated with each other, engaged in debates, even wrote a manifesto for power, where they had a vision for power to be led by the trade unions and the resistance committees, and to kind of push away from any kind of elitist politics. That was one of the spaces in which someone who is what we would call surplus population, surplus to the requirements of capitalism, um, those were the spaces they could go. And that's where media workers developed media training. It was where doctors. And until today, out of these, we have, for example, emergency response rooms, which grew out of the resistance committees, who are also filling in that gap until today. But it's also important to note that in other circumstances, you have a few options. Some of the people that I met during the revolution, their dream during the revolution was to transform Sudan. Now their dream is to be refugees that come to the global north. But in other cases, maybe you join the army or you join the militia. I mean, that militia, the Rapid Support Forces, which is ravaging Sudan, is it plays a systematic role in the sense that it has had open relationships with the Wagner militia that's based out of Russia. It procures gold and owns a gold mine and provides those to the United Arab Emirates, and the United Arab Emirates provides them with ammunition. They've provided mercenaries to Haftar's army in Libya and to the Saudi UAE coalition, which was working with the United States in Yemen. And they also received money from the European Union to stem the flow of migration to Europe. And they provide you with a salary of about $200 a month in a country where that's a lot of money. And so if you have no opportunities and you try to push for a revolution, but global powers and local elites made sure that your revolution couldn't come into fruition, inevitably some people will find themselves almost living with a sense of nihilism and then try to get a job wherever they can. And that's the exact same dynamic that we see in the gangs case that you gave. And I think that that's one of the things that we need to recognize is that a lot of the violence and the conflict that happens, on the one side, people can look at a country like Sudan and say, oh, it's just another African country. They're in civil war. What's new? On the other side, what they're failing to recognize is that situations like Sudan or the emergencies of gang violence in places like Haiti or the rise of gangs in Jamaica and Trinidad, etc., all of that is related to the fact that capitalism is in a deep crisis. Mm-hmm. And that for the longest time during the colonial era, capitalism was about exploiting us. But what's even worse now is there's a writer called Michael Denning, and he said that the only thing worse than being exploited under capitalism is not being exploited under capitalism. And one of the things about that is that now capitalism has dispossessed us of our old traditions of knowing and living and eating and our resources, our systems of symbiosis, which we built with our ecosphere. And it's also left us in a world where everybody has to get a job. And if you don't get a job, you starve. And that recipe means that in a situation like what's happening in Sudan right now, or what's happening in Haiti, what's happening even in the Congo, for example, those circumstances wouldn't have exploded into the emergencies that they are now if the system wasn't in such crisis. And that, again, just to make a complete crazy connection, it also ties into the question of delayed adulthood that's happening even here in the industrial north. A lot of Gustavo Petro at COP28, he said that what's happening in Gaza right now is the future. He said, if we allow the extermination to happen in Gaza, just know that the amount of people who are going to be climate refugees, the amount of people who are going to be refugees who are going to come to the global north, it's going to be acceptable to exterminate them as a process. And so this is really at the heart, to me, of what's going on in Sudan, although it's one of the most neglected and not talked about aspects of the situation. And I can explain the situation more generally, but I think that that's a kind of starting point in which we could have a conversation about how all of these things tie in together, what's going on across the world.
Yeah, I'm so happy you mentioned all that. Like, my friend recently came back from Haiti, and he was talking about the checkpoints he had to go through to catch a flight. And I was just like, I was so blown away just like at how deep it brings me so much sadness and anger to see people, kinfolk folks of similar backgrounds to me going through these things, and to hear what you're talking about in
Mhm.
Sudan, and to bring it into this like global, everything is happening at the same time, and there's a
Yeah.
whole group of people that are either intentionally blind to it or naively blind to it, but either way we are getting forgotten. And it's the layers of devastation that that's bringing is just bringing me, it just makes it so saddening for me as someone from the global south, someone whose family is
Mhm.
there. Like, I feel like I'm saying the same stuff over and over again. And it
Mhm.
feels like you're in this, I feel like the James Baldwin quote of like, is to like look at the world around you and not be in a constant state of rage or anger, is like it, that is like everything that I feel like. And I feel like it's along racial lines, it's along class lines, it's along, you know, geopolitical lines. But I do want to kind of see, Kato, I feel like you are someone
Mhm.
that probably has a lot of thoughts related to this and a lot of,
Mm.
experience and perspective. And so I just want to take a step back and let you kind of jump in with any questions and thoughts that you might have.
Yeah, totally. No, thank you both so much. I've been really soaking up the conversation. Admittedly, Sudan is the what is happening in Sudan is something that I am continuing to learn on. So this has been very illuminating. And you shouted out Gustavo Petro, my president. I'm Colombian. I should have mentioned that when I introduced myself. Actually, I feel
I
like I
did wonder
usually
that.
yeah, I usually lead with that too. So, and there's so many things I'm feeling a lot of resonance on. I likewise, I moved to the US when I was 9 in 2002. Similarly, because there was a civil war going on in my country. And one of the things that was really resonating about the conversation that y'all and that we are all having together, including our listeners, is this idea of street democracy. It like kept on coming up. And I think so much about, we have a professor we're very fond of, Petros Vankakis. He was an international relations professor in the department, head of our poli sci department at our old alma mater. Old, I'm saying that's like double there, but Eric, we can cut that out. But I he had this class that was titled Street Democracy. So really talking a lot about, like, one of the things that really perked up my ears, Mohammed, that you were saying was graffiti. For example, in Medellin, where I'm from, there were parts of the city that experienced urban warfare. And if you go back to if you go to Medellin today, it is a very drastically different place than when my family lived there.
Mhm.
And a lot now, like, one of the biggest tourist attractions in Medellin is something called the graffiti tour, which is a tour through a neighborhood that was literally ravaged by bullets from military helicopters that were brought in from the US through Plan Colombia for the president of Colombia to essentially shoot down on leftist guerrillas, but really they were shooting down on civilians. So now this neighborhood has, I mean, the people of that neighborhood really took it back, right? There was this huge arts and hip hop movement. So graffiti and hip hop are like the lifeblood of that particular neighborhood, and it's really transformed what used to be probably one of the most dangerous places to find yourself in the world at one point in
Mm.
time, into a place where now people, like, I think more foreigners have seen, it's called Comuna 13 than most Colombians, because it's just like um
Mm.
such a big, cultural now, like, part of, I'm like, there's like this category of culture that it's like culture after conflict, culture during conflict, and culture after conflict. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about the ways in which you've seen the Sudanese people, in the midst of what is going on, really attempt to retain to their autonomy, whether that be through art or any other form. I'm so, always really interested in hearing how people, continue to ground themselves in their humanity despite what's going on around them.
That's right. And I think, the examples you gave of street democracy in Colombia do really, really resonate. I think really the most tragic part right now is that in Sudan right now, you're either under the control of territory that's under the militia, which, as we said, it's not just a militia which just comes out of nowhere, but it's a militia that's heavily tied into global systems of extraction, which rely on militias to do that and rely on the precariousness of like being someone who needs to live on doing that. And there are many layers to this when it comes to race, when it comes to like ethnicity within Sudan as well, and the complexities of those dynamics. But in general, that's one of the tragedies is just there's that space seems to have closed for a lot of people, during the revolution was the space where you saw for this brief moment where everybody around you is in a revolutionary mood. You go into the market and you scream Madaniya, which just means like civil state, and the whole market will scream it. You go onto the bus, it was a festive mood. It was a moment of hope, but also a moment of the unleashing of so much Sudanese creativity
Mm.
that would otherwise go to waste under like the capitalist system. And of course, there was also a connection between a lot of the diaspora and the people in Sudan, and there was a lot of money that was flowing in so that there could be more space. So there's that connection
Mm.
of, instead of remittances being this thing where you're just sending money to take care of your individual family based on what you're doing working outside, there was money that was flowing in for that street democracy, and those kinds of things. But I think right now that space is completely closed. And just to give context to some of the
Mm.
listeners, I mean, what's happened since then? There's two key flashpoints. The revolution happened, um, and it succeeded to a degree. But what ended up happening was that the international community in 2019 decided that it would be too extreme for Sudan to transition to democracy immediately. What they worked to do together was to create a military civil democracy partnership. And that was the first mistake, because in 2021, the military, just 3 weeks before it was supposed to hand complete power over to the civilians, overthrew the government in a coup d'etat. And then we were under regime military rule. The war that's broken out recently happened because internally the same militia and army which are fighting against each other were part of that coup government, and negotiations to try to bring back a path towards civil democracy ended up being pitted against each other, because each of them
Mm.
also control lots of political and economic interests across the country, and that eventually fueled into the war that we're in. And now in
Mm.
Sudan, around millions of people have been forcefully displaced. They have nothing to do with what's going on. The rapid support forces in particular, as what happens often with militias and these kinds of formations that exist all across the world, is engaged in horrific massacres, and campaigns of sexual violence. And in general, the situation is such that, like, I don't know if I mentioned it already, but 9 million people I think are internally displaced. Majority
Yeah.
of the entire capital city is emptied. It's been emptied completely. The airport's been destroyed. The hospitals are non-existent. And just a few days ago, recently, there's been a massive internet shutdown. When that happens in Sudan,
Yeah.
it usually means that there's going to be some really, really awful news that's going to come through the airwaves once the internet's back on.
Mhm.
So that's the kind of scenario and situation internally, and that's how you could kind of
Yeah.
describe it domestically. But one of the things to also understand is Sudan was under the state sponsor of terror list. So that meant that the
Mm.
United States had sanctions on Sudan because of the fact that government which the Sudanese people overthrew was seen as a supporter and a patron of terrorism. For example, it was linked to an attack against the U.S. embassy in the late 1990s in Kenya. But one of the things that the international community said was there would be two conditions. This was under the Trump administration, for Sudan to be lifted off the state sponsor of terror and to be, eligible for debt forgiveness and all sorts of stuff that will help its transition to democracy. One of them was that Sudan was forced to pay reparations to the United States, which is particularly insulting, considering that the United States has refused to pay reparations to its own African American descendants. But it was forced to pay reparations for the government which it overthrew. And then it was also forced to enter into a normalization agreement with Israel. Those were the two conditions in which Sudan was going to be allowed back into the international community. And that stalling for time and the negotiations and the process in which that happened led to a huge crisis internally, economic crisis in the country, which led to the cutting of subsidies on fuel and bread, which were the main trigger for the revolution in the first place, and which also led to that revolutionary spirit dying, which is people were getting hungry and people were also saying, is this the revolution we fought for? And that played a huge role in actually delegitimizing for many people the politicians who were supposed to represent them. So nevertheless, the Sudanese people never gave up on their revolution, but it was global things like that, in addition to the fact that the monster, the Rapid Support Forces, which now imposes itself on all of Sudan, but which was also responsible for the genocide in Darfur, Mikhail, which you were talking about. That's also an international monster. It's based on resource extraction. I mean, this kind of organized violence is what is global capitalism doesn't treat it's not corruption. This is not, this isn't people who have gone rogue. This is organized. It needs to be that way. And precisely in a society where the old forms of colonialism, where you force people to work, you don't live in that. You need someone to force people to work. Or you need to figure out some way in which resources will be extracted and flow well. And so the Rapid Support Forces is also a monster of those kinds of international interests, including the interests of the United Arab Emirates, which is the newest kind of subcolonial power in the game, because they play a huge role in bankrolling the Rapid Support Forces. And so in that context, this not only art, not only culture, there's very little is, that's when guns decide. That's when guns decide how politics, how culture, how much culture, how much politics is going to be allowed. And that's kind of the scenario and situation that the Sudanese people are facing right now.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Excuse me, so much for sharing. That was, I think, really, really important and enlightening to reflect on. And I think one of the things that immediately comes up in my head, I mean, the 9 million internally displaced number is just really wild, because just to paint a picture for folks, before Syria happened, Colombia had the most internally displaced people in the world, about 5 million internally displaced. That was only in the early 2000s. And now we're talking about conflicts in which, in civil wars in which 10 million people, actually just looked up the number and it's actually 10 million now, which is astounding. And it's happening very rapidly. And I think it's no coincidence, and this is kind of tied to what you were saying here in the end, that global arms sales are up. And why is the U.S. economy doing so well during a time where there seems to be so much turmoil elsewhere in the world, and how there's a lot of profiteering that is happening off of the backs of and the murder and killings of people in the global South. And I just think that that's a really important piece to drop on. And I think as much as I, it's interesting to talk about, what you were just saying and the lack of space there even is for that creativity for people, the lack of outlets that there are. And I think so much about being part of a diaspora, right? And what, yeah, what those spaces, I mean, it's really important and sobering for us to realize and recognize that there are places where there is no space being made for those things. And then for us to really put ourselves in that perspective and to think this is happening. Like this is, um, people are living in situations where there's like no outlet in any way, shape, or form for the hopelessness you're probably feeling. And I think that that's really important and sobering to reflect on. So thank you for illuminating and talking a little bit more about the space in that way. But yeah, I would love to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on the more global perspective. I think it's no coincidence that we're seeing again the increasingly internally displaced folks across regions in the global south, the increased profits of very small groups of people that are making money off of the selling of weapons, the selling of security forces, mercenaries in these scenarios. And I think you mentioned that earlier too. So, yeah, I think you were doing such a great job of drawing that connection. And I would love to hear just a little bit more of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the things is that, um, yeah, for a lot of people, they see what's going on in these different countries and they think that that's distant and remote. But one of the things to understand is that not only since the independence of Sudan, but over centuries, there's never been a war in the capital city. This is completely unprecedented for the capital city to be emptied of its people. This, as far as Sudanese people are concerned, it feels like it's the end of the world. And what I mean by that is that everything that you thought was stable, everything that you thought, any sort of kind of stability that you thought existed, that the center can hold society apart or any of that, is gone. And for me, rather than seeing what's going on in Sudan as this thing that's distant, which we should think about and care about and be in solidarity with, it might make a lot more sense for people to understand that unless we really restructure the global economy, then the future that Sudan is faced, Sudan is a mirror, or Sudan is a window into the future. I mean, that's nobody would have expected what happened in Syria to have happened, and especially when we were leading the pro-democracy movements. And if these systems of power just conceded to the pro-democracy movements, instead of the elites holding on to whatever power, political and economic power they could have had, a lot of this could have been avoided. It could have been avoided in Syria. It could have been avoided in Sudan. It could be avoided everywhere. And if we don't find a restructuring of the global economy, then we are going to start to see a lot more of these monsters. There's that quote from Gramsci, which is like in between the new society and the old society, that's where monsters come into being, and that's exactly what we're seeing. And so if we don't see a proper transition, and that transition obviously, of course, has to be a green transition, because the biggest threat to us all is the threat of the collapse of our life supporting systems, climate change. We're going to see this. I mean, I think for me, one of the defining thing which binds us all together today is the question of surplus. The fact that we are surplus to the system, that the inequality and the gig work and the fact that here, for example, in the UK, in London, people getting into relationships just to pay rent, these kinds of things quite literally are connected to the kinds of things that are happening in our country, in the sense that the more that grows, the more people try to find answers to it, the more the far right finds a fertile ground to organize itself. But you can only postpone these things for so long. So during the years of during the era of colonialism, one of the ways in which the world was divided was that the global north had become this place for manufactured goods, which it would sell to the whole world, and the peripheries were the spaces of resource extraction. And you extracted those resources by compelling the people to work the land and to work to create resources, which or in the raw material form, and then you turn those into finished goods. And that worked for a while. And the ideas for many of the people who were pushing for the struggles for decolonization was they assumed that if you got rid of the Western picture, if you got rid of those people, what you could do is you could use those productive forces to build your own kind of nation. And from that nation, you can kind of build welfare and etc.
Mm.
But the main idea that was all premised on was the fact that the role of the state with industry was to create jobs for a nation, and that was how you built the nation. What happened instead is that section which called itself the national capitalists, or that section which called themselves the leaders, ended up actually instead forming a pact with the leaders of the former colonial countries. And they left the vast majority of people in a situation where they would even the dream of building the productive forces or whatever, not to say that dream didn't have its problems, but even that dream's been abandoned. And what you have instead actually is a scenario where our elites, you could be a militia kind of elite where you'll sell mercenaries for hire, you'll sell all sorts of these different services of resource extraction. My militia will force the people to work and will give you your agricultural products, etc. Or alternatively, you have another kind of section of the elites who make money off of, for example, oil extraction, or give contracts to these different big corporations, and instead of aiding the country or whatever, they get to get a big amount of money which they can put in the same tax havens as those people who they're working with, extract the resources. What you have then is that relationship between the government and the people, which would be, for example, based on tax, because tax is part of the social contract between the citizen. That's gone because now it's really the relationship between the government and the corporations. But where that leaves the people in the vast majority of the world is jobless, completely redundant. And then, of course, the resource extraction of the raw materials and the finished goods dynamic, it's still working to a degree. I mean, yes, sure, there's the rise of China, there's the rise of these other industrialized countries, but for the most part, that relationship is still intact. Only now, instead of dealing with the colonial official who maybe works with some local tribal elders to exploit everyone, you're dealing with the militia. If I'm you could be I could be, in Russia, and I could be part of the Wagner group, and I could be dealing with the rapid support forces in Sudan. I could be an aspiring country from the global south who now also wants to kind of be like the former colonizer, like the UAE, and I could also hire a militia. And then as far as the militia is concerned, if you have all of these people who are unemployed, or the gangs, in the case of Haiti, for example, they can join in. And that kind of status quo, if that isn't resolved in a society which is based on providing jobs, providing a green transition, and redrawing the structure of the global economy entirely, the kind of dislocation that's happening because of that, which is leading especially to huge migration waves, that's going to continue until the crisis comes here. That's the boomerang effect, which Amy Césaire was talking about, where you allow all of this stuff to happen in the colonies or in the global south, really, really far away, and it comes back. Mm-hmm. It comes back to haunt you. And before that happens, you have all sorts of rise of the far right, you have all sorts of reactionary stuff, but it's coming for you. And so that's, I think, where the global dimension is, of someone who really, really heartbroken about what's going on in his own country. Is kind of the message that we obviously want to send to everyone, is that it's not about this could happen to you, it's that it will happen to you unless we all work together globally to try to restructure the global economy.
Fucking hell.
Woo, what a gigantic...
Damn, Mo.
I don't even know how we moved from there. That was just so good.
We could move into Mikkel's ADHD session, which is that my brain is spiraling with like a million thoughts. Are we ready for it?
I'm like, wait, so many
Ready?
threads.
All right,
Go,
this is gonna be my
Mikkel.
rapid fire ADHD. This is a new segment that we may not ever replicate ever again. Yeah, there's so much in there. First of all, shout out Gramsci. You know, like what a great thinker to draw upon. For folks who don't know, Gramsci was like a pretty leftist socialist thinker and philosopher that stayed in Italy during the rise of Mussolini and the subsequent fascist regime. So if we're talking about fascism and the rise of fascism, it's really hard not to call on someone like Gramsci, who literally died on that value of like not leaving his country despite the state that it was in. And I think from there's just like so many things that I want to talk about. First thing, the idea of democratic consolidation, I think, is so important. And what you were highlighting in, you know, Egypt and Sudan, this idea that we can get funded by the global north for our revolutionary ideas, because our revolutionary ideas are coming against a leader who hasn't quite opened up the economic pathways that the US or the UK or Germany wanted. And they'll fund the shit out of that. That's what happened in Egypt. That's what happened in Libya. We're like, we got to take down these dictators, get them out of here. And then as soon as democratic consolidation is that transition point and that perspective that's about to take charge, they abandon us. And then they point to us and be like, that's why you shouldn't have revolution. That's why you can't oppose the capitalist system, because you could end up, you know, like these people, especially in Europe, talking about Libyans like they're animals. Like they brought upon themselves that situation, even though they were the big, as you were talking about, they were the big exporters of mercenaries. They were the big exporters of capital to fund a revolution. They were the ones that were stoking the fires and allowed the type of violence that occurred in Libya, Egypt, Syria, all these places. They love that until it starts challenging the status quo. So I think that idea of like, how do we get revolutions to get to consolidation cannot be talked about without talking about the external factors that will cut it off. And so for the listeners, kind of really, you know, like this is a trope that gets talked about a lot when it comes to the global south. It's the same thing with corruption. The idea of corruption is only applied to the people receiving the money, right? You got Democratic Republic of Congo, you're corrupt, you're spending money on this hotel, you're receiving money, but no one ever talks about the person that's giving them the money. No one ever talks about the Swiss, the Germans, the UK handing money basically to these leaders, but that corruption isn't talked about. That's just aid. But to use that money is corruption. So I think those concepts are really, I think I just wanted to like kind of condense and simplify those a bit. We talked a little bit about, the one thing that I did also want to mention is like culture is abundance. Culture as resilience is something that we as Global South folks have gone through too often. And I remember actually it was in a street democracy class with Petros where we had a pretty big debate with like, it was like a few of us and then the whole class, where we were talking about this idea and this concept of like, can you name the most like prosperous civilizations? And the common thread amongst all of them is that they had the most abundance. Not just abundance in terms of economy, they had abundance in terms of time. They had abundance in terms of food. They didn't have to worry about where am I going to get my next meal? How am I going to like leisure? Like Plato, that dude was sitting around all day. I don't know a single person in America right now that has that much free time. And so the height of civilization, the height of thinking, the height of our most profound ideas is only going to come from abundance. And this idea that we have to somehow force culture and force creative thinking as resilience strategy, we can do it. That's what we've always done as like people of the global south living under oppression. But it's actually through abundance that the best of that comes forth. And I really just hate this like conceptualization that like struggle is the way that we find that. It's the scenario that we're under, but it's not the one that produces the best version of that. And then the last couple of thoughts is like, yeah, the response right now to conflict is a real indicator and a window into how people are going to respond during climate refugees, right? Like, if we can't handle what is happening in Sudan, we will not be able to function with what is happening across the Sahara, across sub-Saharan Africa. That time bomb, none of these global north countries are ready to deal with. And it's like they're the big inhibitors to us having solutions. They're the ones that really inoculate our ability to move at a pace that is going to address the magnitude of climate change. And for me, as someone who's like, again, I'm a black and brown body, you know, like my diaspora, my lineage is rooted in the global south. I have no faith in global north governments to help my people when the tides go higher, you know, like, and I think that kind of comes back to this piece of what they will export to us, right? Like, it is no coincidence that the people speaking Spanish in Haiti at the start of this conflict in Haiti were Colombian, right? This idea of like militias being used and utilized across the global south and pushed around, and it's like, throw your hands up in the air and be like, I wasn't involved. But we all know that it's the morsel of truth that might get stretched into conspiracy, but the morsel of truth is still there. The US had a role in the downfall of Haiti. They had interest in it.
I was going to say explain, yeah.
Yeah, they had interest in that. And it's like they used their relationship with the Colombian government and Colombian militia to set forth something that we cannot take back. What is happening in Haiti is irreversible. I cannot find hope, and my friends who are Haitian don't have a lot of hope for what is happening in Haiti. How do you grow food if you can't move fertilizer around without having to pay money to every checkpoint that's run by a gang? Think about the economic hardship of that. And that is a US imposed thing. In Trinidad, you were talking about oil. We had a state-run oil and gas company. This happened a few years ago, maybe pre-pandemic, but the pandemic really, I think, turned attention away from it. The executives dissolved the state-run gas company. This was like offshore drilling, oil, all gas. Those executives started up and had in place an oil and gas company that was privately owned, which they then seeded themselves as executives, working with BP and executives from Europe to run the Trinidad offshore and onshore refineries. My uncle had to go into early retirement 10 years early. he had to take his pension and go, you know. But for the younger folks, like my other uncle who works on the refinery fields, like, he's 30 something, you know, he's not that much older than me. He's maybe in his 40s now. What prospect does he have? You know, and he lives in more of a rural part. So it's like, is he around the gangs in Trinidad? Is he hanging out with those guys? Does he see that those guys have a pocket full of change and he's got joblessness, you know?
Yeah.
And so for me, I think like all of these things start to intersect, and it's like, I can't talk about this stuff without wanting to scream, because I feel like there's a whole audience of people that do not understand how profoundly interconnected these issues are. We can't talk about Palestine without talking about what's happening in Sudan, and we can't talk about what's happening in Sudan without going and doing our research on Congo. And sadly, I don't have anyone to talk to that's from the Congo that could talk to me about what's happening. And so this inability to actually find the root and the information and be in community and coordination around all these things that are happening is also making it really impossible for us that have to work 10 to 12 hours a day, that have all of our time occupied, to be global citizens and show up in a way that is counter to the status quo, right? And this is all by design. The reason why you maybe have less time to listen to this podcast on your way to work, or I mean, I hope you're not going to work. I hope everyone's still remote, but like the reason that you have less and less time for leisure and learning and understanding is because they do not want you to flourish. They being the state, they being the system, they being the global order of global north capitalist countries. And I feel like this is part and parcel with like everything that is going on, right? They will accept conflict to a point because there is a profit to be made from it, and because it keeps things moving along, and it distracts us long enough that they can start meddling and moving things forward in a different direction. Like you can't even think about how expensive eggs are or what you can afford, because how do you compare that to the plight that's going on over there? And so I think some of it is just like an acceptability of like this works in our favor, but I think all of it is also there's direct involvement that I think sometimes gets missed.
This has been such an amazing conversation. I just have to say, like, it's really always so like enlightening to hear. Like, we're all from the global south, right? It sounds like we all immigrated from the global south to a global north country for a lot of different factors, right? And I think it's so important for all of us to talk about our experiences and really see a reflection of a larger system that's dictating what is happening right now. As you like so like beautifully really connected that, Mohammed. So thank you so much. And I think in terms of sort of wrapping our conversation, and I think about this a lot as someone from the Colombian diaspora. I lived in Providence, Rhode Island, here in the U.S. for like most of my teenage life, into going into college. And one of the things, I was part of a cultural Colombian group as part of the diaspora, and a lot of what we worked around was really envisioning what our relationship to our country looks like, and what for people that are living, so for our families, our friends, what do they envision for their like reality every day. So we did a couple, and we did a really couple of fun art projects where we got together as a community and talked about our experiences of the Civil War. And it was just such an incredible way to connect with people that lived in very different, like, a lot of people in our session lived in Bogota, which is like really far from Medellin, but really at the end of the day, what brought us all together is the shared vision of an alternative to the reality that we lived at one point, and that our people continue to live. So I would love to just hear, what are the visions and what are the demands of the people of Sudan that you have heard, or what do you feel as someone from the diaspora? Like, what do you envision? What does that look like for you? And yeah, just like enlighten us. I think it's like really, really important. It's really important for us to, in the conversations that we're having together, like, make space for all of the imagination that we can possibly make space for. Like, imagination is just such an incredibly important tool. And like I said earlier, we need to stop living. We don't want to live in the imagination of the people that made the current world right now. So we have to create our own. So yeah, for you, what does that look like, Mohammed, for yourself as a person? Who comes from the place that you come from.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And especially what you talked about art. I mean, for a lot of us, first of all, what made the sit-in front of the military headquarters so beautiful was festivity, was that sense of going back to also what you said, Mikhail, abundance in terms of the abundance of things to do, the music, the art, the culture, the resistance. For many of us, if you asked us at that moment what we wanted Sudan to look like, we wanted Sudan to look like that sit-in. Because it was also the space where, for the first time, people who were divided from each other were allowed to come and speak to one another. And how we get there is a whole other thing. The political vision, which I think I align myself most with, is the political vision of the resistance committees. So in Sudan, across the country, we've got around like 5,000 resistance committees in different neighborhoods, who all have, many of which have signed a charter called the Charter for People's Power. And the Charter for People's Power makes the argument that all the old forms of politics which exist in Sudan need to be abolished, and that what we need instead is a Sudan that's from the ground up. It's from the it's based on direct democracy. It's based on workers' rights, and it's based on women's rights, and and they even released a statement calling for their vision of what it means to end the war. The resistance committees, prior to the negotiations which broke down, which led to the war, had a slogan, and their slogan was "No partnerships, no legitimacy," and there's a third no. It's لا شرعية لا تفاوض. So yeah, no negotiations, no partnerships. I mean, that's the three things that are actually mean the same thing, which is do not accept the system, and do not negotiate with the system, and do not partner with the system. And the main argument they also had was the militias should be dissolved, and the military should return to the barracks. What we have instead, obviously, is a militia which has a lot of political and economic interests, and that's played a huge role in this conflict that we're going through. And of course, the military also is the same. And that's, again, based on our broader conversation, is based on the structure of the global economy. And it's kind of that thing about what was talked about in terms of also corruption. Corruption isn't a thing that's related to bad global south people who can't govern their own countries. Corruption is, it's kind of like that slogan which says if there were no corrupt leaders, they didn't want them. They need them. At the end of the day, capital's whole thing is about making sure things move and making sure things get to where they need to get to on time. That's why we saw the whole when the Houthis blocked the channel. We saw literally the entire world was ready to go to war for that, because of the simple fact that things need to move to where they need to be. And the status quo as it is right now is we're fine with the fact that the vast majority of the world's population are excluded from the economy, and the way in which we can make sure things move is through organized violence, right? Violence in the peripheries is organized. And so what we also need to make sure is we need, on a global scale, to curtail that structure. And that structure, and it's not about making claims about human rights, which is what the governments claim to do, but then pay them off to stem there's a failure here to deal with the root cause issue. And the root cause issue is that. And obviously, if we are going to do so, what we would need to do then is the people of the global south need to come together and unite. And then they need to demand these things. They need to demand loss and damages. They need to demand reparations. And they should fund a project where that creativity, which is being curtailed because of the absence of opportunities, it's somewhat like the Green New Deal, a global Green New Deal was what some people are calling it. I mean, that's really where we need to be moving towards. Just one last thing, because I'll just talk about what the alternative is. There's this really dystopian video that was a training video by the Pentagon, and it was released, I think The Intercept released it in around 2012 or something like that. I can't remember, I might be wrong. And it basically talks about how the world is going to be in a situation where there's going to be climate induced disasters. There's going to be a lot of people who are jobless, and they'll end up joining militias. And they said the future is here, and the future is urban, is what the video is called. And instead of saying, okay, so what we need to do is restructure the global economy, what they say instead is we are unprepared for this world that we're coming into. The techniques of warfare which we've mastered in Iraq and in Afghanistan are not equipped to deal with this. The video also says that if 1% of the population is unemployed in a city that's, I don't know, like, that could end up being 100,000 people who are adversaries. And basically its solution is what we need to do is we need to prepare how to violently put this kind of world which is coming into being down. Another crazy thing that was in that Pentagon training video, which again was leaked to The Intercept, was this idea that a lot of people would actually physically live underground. And it's like, it's not surprising to me that the science fiction has had a really big comeback these days, but specifically cyberpunk kinds of sci-fi, which is
Oh, we lost you for a sec.
Okay, yeah.
I think we lost you right around where you were talking about cyberpunk reemerging.
Okay. But it's recording again, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah,
what about
I think the mic is fine. Yeah.
Good. Just the camera. I don't know what's going on with this camera. Anyways, sorry about that, y'all. But it's not surprising to me. It's not surprising to me that lots of science fiction, like what's that Korean show called again? Squid Game, Snowpiercer, Andor. All of this stuff kind of points out to this like global condition, and it taps into an anxiety that so many people can almost see that they feel like almost they can relate to it. It's no surprise to me that that's and then also the Pentagon is releasing these dystopian videos. It all seems connected to me. And I think that that's kind of the world. That's the alternative. What we need instead is more solar punk dreams. Can you just give me one moment? I think someone's knocking on my door. Just give me one moment.
Thing.
Yeah.
Just to ask, how are y'all on time, Gato and Eric?
I have to go in 15 minutes because I have a work meeting.
Okay.
But I think I'm good to stay until 15 after the hour.
Okay, Eric, you? Get to the wrap. Okay. Cool. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Fair. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So if Kato, if you have to jump off at 1:15, just feel free to jump off, and
Sounds
then
good.
I'm happy to do the wrap. Sorry, go ahead, Mo.
Thank
you
you.
can finish
Yeah.
up.
Oh no, I think I concluded that question.
Cool.
Does that sound good, Eric? The way that I concluded it, do you think that it could flow?
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I was just like, I lost train of thought and then started another convo.
No worries.
Yeah, I think that that's like so important. I feel like what you were talking about is just like radical imagination of something different. And before we kind of conclude, I think the last question I had for you is actually not a question at all. It's a celebration of the work that you are doing, right? Like actualizing all of this thought and this theory and this. I think probably you've done however many years of education at this point to like put that into something. So congrats on being featured on the Intercepts podcast recently. If you want to share a little bit more about that episode, feel free to. And also, about the Decolonial Centre, this project that you've started from the ground up in collaboration with some folks in Brazil. What is the inspiration behind that, and what do you hope to get out of the Decolonial Centre? If you can give everyone like a quick snippet, and then also a way to support the Decolonial Centre. So over to you to kind of share and promote what you're doing out in the world.
Thank you. And actually, Mikkel was played a huge role. One of the first people to believe in the project when it was still just an idea. So thanks so much for being with us in that journey for so long. I mean, the Decolonial Centre is part of that same thing. I want us that old tradition of uniting people in the global South and recognizing that the thing which we're confronting with is colonialism, that you can't talk about global capitalism without talking about colonialism. That's the main idea in a nutshell of the Decolonial Centre. But obviously, in a more humble sense, because we know that we can't change all of that in a small organization. We see ourselves as a political education outfit. So what we're trying to do is educate people on traditions of anti-colonialism, and also provide a space for people who are trying to change the world, to understand or to debate, to discuss, and to understand how to do so through decoloniality, through anti-colonialism, through those kinds of traditions. We've got a mini encyclopedia, which is where we're hoping people can go to just get really quick knowledge on different aspects of colonialism, whether that's colonialism related to the biosphere or violence or the economy, etc. We're also hopefully, I've promised this so many times, it's never happened, which is we're hoping to do a newscast. It's my goal every week, but I can never get around to figuring out how to make sure that it's up to par and that the workflow makes sense. But I've got to figure that out soon. And then we do lots of mini short social media short videos. We're based in the UK, so a lot of our relationships that we are in the UK in terms of like the organization's headquarters in the UK. But our team's made up of another guy from Sudan who's our film editor, and then two friends from Brazil. And we're hoping that this grows. We're hoping that we grow to many different countries, and that's the more ambitious side of our project. And yeah, I guess that's kind of the Decolonial Centre in a nutshell. Yeah.
Awesome.
Cool.
Well, I'm really excited to see where that goes. I feel like we, over the course of this episode, have learned so much. There's so many beautiful threads that we've woven. If folks have never noticed the Upon Request podcast kind of cover image or the logo that Kato created had that thread on the backdrop of like a corkboard, and that's like an early inception of this, is like connecting the dots through conversation. And I feel like we really displayed like the Paulo Freire idea of the educational ideas that he has, and just to say his goal of education was to have the freedom to speak, think, and act in an authentic way. And I feel like that is what political conversations are about, and this idea of public education, where we as a collective have all of the answers within our ideas, within our lived experience, within our existence. And when we have conversation together around the political realities that we face, we can come up with all of the solutions and machinations of how we move and operate for it. And I feel like the Sudanese people have shown an example of that in their revolutionary spirit. They continue to be in struggle. And as people in struggle, they deserve our solidarity. They deserve our attention, and they deserve us struggling with them to learn, to adapt, to connect. And it's not the burden of them to educate us, which Mohammed has done here today so eloquently, but it is our privilege to be engaged in that conversation when we are given the opportunity. So deep appreciation to you, Mo. Thank you, Kato, for just so many brilliant thoughts and connections to your lived experience. And this has been another episode of Upon Request. We hope you guys keep listening and keep asking questions and keep having conversations. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, that was
Nice.
so awesome.